getting more into doing some of the computer gaming myself. And I just loved it. So it really started as something that was a bonding experience, and really was a catalyst for my relationship with my brother a little bit. And then as I kind of took it into my own hands and grew up with it and got older, I started finding that, you know, it was a new medium for storytelling. You could connect with characters in a way that I never did with other mediums like books or movies. And there was a real power there to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And those were things I just thought about as I played, and, you know, kind of would gravitate towards the type of games that I would play. And it carried, you know, all the way through and into medical school again, when I realized, you
Wow.
know, okay, the power to empathize, there's got to be value there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what started it all.
That's really interesting because, I think my biggest talking point with games is the community. Obviously, I'm a community manager, but I love the connectivity, and that's how I got started gaming too. Like, it's funny, our stories, because I also almost went into medical school. I applied and everything, but I never went down that route. I kind of had that before I got to the actual medical school. I had that vision of being more of a content creator and influencer with helping people connect on a larger scale and find these kind of tools. But I started playing F-22 Fighter on PC with my brother. He's 8 years older than me, so he was flying the jet around, and he would let me take the joystick. We had one of those joysticks back on the old Windows 95. Hard to believe, like, they had those games back then.
Yeah.
But it was really simple, but it was so much fun to play with people. I mean,
Right.
and since then, like, I've played some single player games. I've played through like Fallout and stuff, but really the games that I've stuck with and that I've loved the most are the ones I get to play with people.
Totally.
There's that like group dynamic that really is powerful. You don't get from just reading a book or even watching a TV show with someone. Like, yeah, I like to watch through TV shows with my wife and people, but it's not the same as playing a game together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, some of my fondest memories from college even was sophomore year. I lived in a big suite with some of my closest friends, and we were really into, of course, Super Smash Brothers, but also PlayStation All-Stars was out at that time, and we loved PlayStation All-Stars, even though a lot of people didn't. And we would play that game like into the late hours of the night and just be going wild and getting up out of our seats and screaming at each other and cheering and crying. It was just so much fun. And then I actually had a more recent experience where I was in Seattle for a work trip a couple of years ago, and I had some free time, so I went to the Museum of Pop Culture. And I'm not really so into museums, but this one I had to check out because it was like it was a nerd museum. And I was by myself, and they actually had a special exhibit on video games at the time. And so I walked in, and one of the exhibits that they had, one of the booths, was just like a pick up and play on a big screen. You could play Overcooked. And so I picked up a controller. I don't know, I think I had played it before, but I love the game. And three other strangers picked up a controller next to me. And if you know Overcooked, it's such a collaborative and heated and exciting and crazy, frantic game. But you really have to work together. And it was this incredible experience, actually, where here I was next to three complete strangers, and we're having to communicate and talk to each other and become this team in order to progress in the levels. And it really takes a lot of communication, that game.
Right.
And then, after we were done playing, we put down the controller and we went our separate ways. But I don't know if they ever think back about me, but I think back about that time often, because it was this really neat moment where you just formed this connection and this partnership with complete strangers. That was a very cool thing, I thought.
Yeah, the connectivity is definitely a big value point, I think, in gaming overall. I mean, you see that everywhere you go. I mean, college campuses. Back in the day, we used to have LAN parties. I'm sure you did those. A lot of those. I played Age of Empires with my buddies, literally connecting an Ethernet cable all the way downstairs to my computer to link up. And that kind of like brings people together in a special way. It really does. And like you have those both lasting friendships as well as just lasting memories. Like you may not even know the people you played with, but I've made tons of friends playing games like CS:GO. Some of my oldest friends online are from playing games and just running into people, and you're like,
Right?
you get to know people's personalities when you see them lose. You know, that one kid
Yeah,
who
for
just
better or
rages. You're
worse,
like,
I guess.
I don't know if I want to be friends with that kid, but then there's the people who are very kind and they help you and they're walking you through the process because they see you're not as learned as them. So there's like this handing down of knowledge through the player base that's very special. So that's definitely a big value point. I wanted to talk about the highlights of what makes games special for our health. Obviously the connectivity is one, but what's another way that do you think that games have been impactful on people's health?
Well, I think there's a lot, and I think it's important to differentiate between games as something that can be and are therapeutic for an individual and can be used as a therapeutic tool for an individual, and a game that is itself a therapy.
Hmm.
So I think that games in general and all the ways that we're talking about can very easily be therapeutic for somebody. And for many gamers, again, just like we're saying, they probably are. And even in the healthcare field, if you have a psychologist, probably someone like Dr. Gabe, who is a gamer, and Dr. Gabe, I don't know if you see patients, but someone who sees patients, it's possible they may even use games as a tool for therapy through their narrative or the experiences you'd have from that. That's one
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
That's a little bit different than from what I focus on, which is how can games actually themselves be a therapy or be a tool to unlock a therapy to its full potential.
Hmm.
So when we're talking about games as a therapy, I kind of break to a couple different buckets. The first is it doesn't necessarily have to be about the game itself, but games and the principles of game design at its core is about engagement, and it's about keeping people playing the game, right? And
Hmm.
if you transfer that to the design for healthcare, keeping people doing a treatment, right? So I think there's a lot of things that you can learn from actual principles of game design and transfer them either one to one or a little bit more abstract to the field of healthcare. Excuse me. Or, oh, sorry, I'm suffering from a bad cough. It just won't leave me alone.
Worries, no worries.
um, but to actually keep patients engaged with their healthcare providers and with their management plan. So that's one way that you can use games and game design to actually influence healthcare. The other way is a lot more direct, which is something that's really exciting in a new field that's popping up, which is called digital therapeutics. Now, it doesn't have to
Hmm.
be about games, but games are certainly a major talking point in the field of digital therapeutics. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It is digital therapies. It is something, a software based something, that by engaging in it, you are actually receiving a therapeutic benefit, a clinically validated therapeutic benefit.
Hmm.
Games are very helpful for that. And the reason you see a lot of games in digital therapeutics is mainly because of its cognitive effects. So the effects that games have on your cognitive control and cognitive ability. Within cognitive control, that kind of opens up a whole subcategory of um, processing and cognitive capacity and attentional control and all these different neural pathways that are firing to that have implications in certain disease or disorder states.
Hmm.
And so this with digital therapeutics is actually not just taking a game that exists and say, yeah, first person shooters, it's well documented and well studied that there are some therapeutic effects or improvements to cognitive control by playing first person shooters. Not just taking that and stopping, you take that and you say, okay, Now I'm going to create an experience, often outlined by a algorithm that's running in the background, that is going to distill this effect down to its very core, and I'm going to build out the experience from that. So actually, we're taking the therapeutic benefit that's well documented and studied from these different types of games, and we're going to create from the ground up a filtered experience to just focus on that aspect. So the kind of shining example for this is a company called Achille Interactive, which has a product called EndeavorRx. And EndeavorRx that is going to be clinically studied and authorized by the FDA to actually be a treatment for childhood ADHD. And the reason is because essentially it's this game. It kind of looks like a Temple Run type game, mobile game. And by playing it, there's an algorithm that is always pushing you to your limit, into your kind of maximum at the time ability to be able to affect your attentional control. So people with ADHD, they have deficits in attention. And so that is what this focuses on. So all the little things that you're doing that any gamer is familiar with, you're trying to hit the portals as you're running, and avoiding the bad things and collecting the good things and not collecting the bad things, all these different things you're doing at once. And this algorithm in the background is always changing the difficulty of the game so that you're going up the incline and progressing. Your ability is progressing as you're playing. And that's what I mean by actually the act of playing the game is providing a therapy for you. And then the last one, which I'll mention because it's we don't have to go deep into it. The last one I think that games have a real value for in the field of healthcare is education. The reason is because different things you're doing. Yeah, education is all about failure, but in traditional education, failure is a bad thing. When failure is actually a key to learning, and games, that's what it's all about. Every time you have a game over, you try again, and you're motivated to try again. So taking that game design and applying it to education, and that's kind of a very long explanation of where I focus.
That was really great. That was basically 3 key points then that we can kind of get into a little bit more here in our time, and then we'll have some question and answer time from the audience as well. BU asked then, I want to know what Gabe's thoughts are, but real quick, looking at the chat, a lot of people are asking different questions. What types of games are commonly used for therapy? That's pretty broad, but do you have a specific game or two in mind that you were thinking about that's more of a filtered experience for therapy?
Well, the EndeavorRx game by that company Achille is the only game today that is FDA authorized for an actual treatment of a disorder. And so they were groundbreaking because when they applied for FDA authorization, the FDA took a look at them and said, oh, we have nothing that exists like this. There's no pathway in terms of regulation that we can follow. We don't really know what to do with you. And so they actually had to do what's called a de novo pathway, which is create something totally new and create this kind of new type of therapeutic. But the great thing about that is now that they've done that and laid the groundwork, other people can now come and they won't have that resistance that they had, because they can say, oh no, that pathway that you did for EndeavorRx, that ADHD game, we're the same kind of thing. So you're going to see a lot of games that are applying for FDA authorization, which basically just means that it's clinically validated, and ideally insurance companies would be able to pay for this in the United States. And so you'll see a lot of things in the behavioral health realm that are using similar technology to achieve improvements in cognitive control.
I wonder, Gabe, if you could speak on this, if there's any way we could quantify the effect that Amaru has had on people, because I know so many people have said, man, this has helped me get through some really tough times. It's helped my mood in incredible ways. Like, the testimonials are out the wazoo, but no one's looking at it from that perspective. Like, hey, this is a really good tool for say doctors or pediatric physicians to help with X, Y, or Z.
Well, we've had first off, I just want to say thank you so much to the Digital Doc for that wonderful overview of digital therapeutics and all that good stuff. But Noah Falstein and Endeavor have done is really cool, and it's definitely forging a new path. And it's definitely a growing area. And there are other products out there. For instance, Helium RX is a really interesting one. It uses neurofeedback and in a meditation type context. I think Noah and Achille were probably the first to kind of get it across the finish line with being like the first FDA approved game. But there are other just not yet FDA approved digital therapeutics out there. And Sam, yeah, Amaru is absolutely a digital therapeutic. So basically the things that are in Amaru, the meditations that we have in there, the gratitude journals that we have in there, the practices that are in there, there's nothing in that game where there isn't at least 5 decades of well-documented research saying that if you did this stuff outside of the game, it would produce the reduction in anxiety, the improvement in depression, the type of stuff that we're trying to do. So yeah, I mean, if we had a grant, and who knows, maybe that's the angle I should take with the Unity for Humanity grant. I should go different direction with it. The only thing we would need to do is have a control and experimental group, and have the control group play a different game, and the experimental group do Amaru. I have I'd bet a substantial amount of money that we will see the effects that we would expect to see, and we already know that we would see. So it might actually be interesting to look into, and I know
I've looked at those slides you've done before that have the scientific backing for all the concepts, and I don't know if Amiad's probably hasn't seen that, but I mean, I'm sure you've done some sort of study or looked at a lot of studies as well, Doc. I'm gonna call you Doc for now. Have you ever run a study like that with on some games or collected data on actual gamers and how they've been impacted?
So the only thing that I've done in the study realm, and the reason I haven't spent more time there, is just because I'm so interested on the actual design aspect of this. I find it much more interesting personally than the clinical study design part, which is incredibly important, right? But not where I want to spend my time. You mentioned Helium. I worked in medical school with a company that was similar to Helium, but a little bit different. But they were basically doing the same thing, which was biofeedback in VR. And at the time, and I still am, but I was very interested in virtual reality because I thought it was a powerful experience. The power to take someone away from where they are and immerse them. And so we did a study actually on healthcare providers where we had half of the study group doing biofeedback in virtual reality and the other half doing biofeedback just by using a standard mobile app. And of course, we were comparing the differences.
Can you explain biofeedback real quick without?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So biofeedback is essentially the act of really controlling your own biologic parameters. So one way you could do this, right, is by controlling your breathing, right? But a thing that's harder to control is your heart rate. However, there are ways that you can breathing rhythms that you can get yourself into that in turn can actually affect your heart rate. And so that's biofeedback, is when you're doing something to actually affect your physiologic parameters with the addition of actually seeing that something as in real time as you're doing it. So in real time, you're looking at your heart rate and you're seeing how the exercises that you're doing are affecting it, and that has this feedback loop to it. And so
it's different than haptic feedback. Haptic feedback's the opposite, where like the game is physically interacting with you.
Well, haptic is just one form of feedback. Haptic is just touch sensation. Feedback can come in many different ways. But what's being described here is just that we are representing in some way a biological response to what you're doing in the game. So that could be represented haptically, it could be represented visually, but it's a biological thing that we're representing to let the player know that what you are doing is having an effect on your biological state. So in this case, heart rate, right? We could represent this with a heart rate monitor on the screen. We could represent it with some sort of auditory sound. We could represent it with haptic feedback, but all of it is biofeedback. It's just different ways of delivering that.
So haptic feedback falls under biofeedback. Okay.
No, haptic feedback just falls under feedback. It's the biofeedback component of it is that it's coming from your body. So for instance, with Helium, or actually early experiments we did when we were looking at Amaru, you can use like the neurofeedback headbands, right? So that's using brain waves to give feedback, right? And now you can use heart rate to get feedback. You can use galvanic skin response. It's like how conductive your skin is also a stress measure. So yeah, there's but basically when a biological source in your body is providing something that we report back to the player on their behavior, that we call that biofeedback.
Okay, so do you, Doc, do you think like games like, or I'm not games, like apps like Fitbit and some of these other ones that are tracking and giving you points, rewarding you, would you consider those games?
I think there's a difference between games and gamification. And so
True.
Gamification has its merit and has its values. It's something that I try and stay away from, because I think it's really easy to approach a problem and say, how do we improve engagement and how do we get people to care about how many steps they took today? Well, let's throw in a leaderboard, or let's throw in a trophy system or something like that. And like I said, like that might have some value, but it's, in the grand scheme of things, probably a little shallow. And I guess it's okay if you know what it is, which is gamification. But I do think that's different from a game, which a game, what's special about that is the actual game design, and also has to do with that loop. And good game design is, very similar to, we talked about Endeavor X and Achilles, that algorithm that's kind of pushing you forward. That really what that is kind of very defined game design, which is, you kind of plot that flow chart, which many games, not all games, but it's kind of a sign of a good game, a fun game, which is where you're playing and you want to be challenged just enough, right? You don't want to be too challenged, because that'll make it not interesting to you. And you don't want to be not challenged enough, because same thing, but you want to be right in that sweet spot that keeps you kind of wanting to move forward. And I think being in that flow state is also well studied, that has positive health effects, and flow states are not just relevant to games, but are relevant to whatever puts you in that state. It could be working on an Excel document and losing track of time. It could be, playing a game of basketball. Right? Yeah. Anything that kind of gives you that feeling of just kind of being in the zone and losing track of time is what puts you in that flow state. And that's a very good state to be in, both for your mental health, but also for learning and succeeding in some type of skill. And so that's what game design can do. So I think that's the difference. That's not what a leaderboard can do. So that's the difference.
So Sam, we're now 3 for 3 just within the past couple of weeks. We had me, we had the space juggler, now we have the digital doc, all bringing it back to flow theory. Like every time.
I was just going to say that.
Flow theory. So yeah, if you haven't checked out Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work, this is the guy. That balance of difficulty and ability, getting us into that state of flow. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, Gabe's actually been doing a game design workshop Tuesday mornings for a little bit, just messing around. But he's been very intentional about going into this at the beginning, before we've gotten into any of the like fun, creative stuff, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about game design.
Well, so I just want to bring back to the question of gamification versus a game, and I mean it's to me it's a sliding scale. When we were making Amaru, for instance, investors kept asking us, "Well, is it an app or is it a game?" And I was like, "It's kind of both. It kind of sits in a weird place in the middle." But when we think about game design and we think about the aesthetics there's aesthetics of game design, there's narrative components of game design, there are the mechanical components of game design, and I think what Doc here is referring to, that is sort of the worst way to do gamification, is you think, oh yeah, I'll just slap a leaderboard up there, because games have leaderboards, right? And if we put a leaderboard, then that'll make our app more gamified. It'll be more like a game. Won't that be fun? But we talk about, with the game design that I've done and what we've been talking about in the game design sessions on Tuesday mornings, starting with the emotional experience and then building and selecting mechanics that create an emotional experience. So, for instance, in Endeavor, if the emotional experience that the game designers are trying to create is one of being pushed forward to one's potential, pushed forwards to one's capacity, this algorithm they have running in the background will help to do that. If the goal that they're trying to create is a feeling of sort of stress a little bit to sort of train the having divided goal conditions where you're having to get that thing, ignore that thing. These are mechanics that help facilitate that. Contrast that, for instance, with like Amaru, where so many people in our community struggle with anxiety. So we created, the goalless mode of claiming Cairns, where we took time pressure away because we wanted to create a relaxing experience. So it's not to say necessarily. So basically, at the end of the day, what's bad is lazy gamification. What's bad is I'm taking an app and I'm saying, oh, what do games have? They have scores. Okay, well, we'll just make scores happen. Well, in scores, in service of what? In service of what type of emotional experience? And I think when we talk about really traditional games, because they tend to be more of an artistic presentation, there's usually a story being told. There's usually something there. We're really starting with an emotive experience first. That's why we try to think of them more as games versus gamified experiences. But it really is kind of on a continuum.
Yeah, that was very well said. It makes me think. I do some work for a company called Level X that makes video games for doctors for education, and so often it's to educate them on a new type of procedure, or new medical device, or drug therapy, something like that. And so in the past, some of Level X's games have been more simulations, which is okay. We have to educate on a new procedure. Let's make a simulation of that procedure. And what that was lacking, I think, is exactly, Dr. Gabe, what you're saying, which is that emotional component, more relevant to education. It's really, what is the learning objective here? So when I came in, I really tried to get them to focus on that question, is let's really define the objective, and whether that is an emotional objective, a learning objective, a therapeutic objective. What is the objective that we're trying to do? And let's create the game design around that objective. So I think you're exactly right. As long as you have that that core kind of orb of focus of what you're trying to do, and then you put the game around that, and because of that, then that's a game. If it's just putting elements of a game around it, but not because of it, then that's gamification.
Interesting. That's a good distinguishing element there, because I think a lot of people do definitely just try to throw in game elements to something and try to make it interesting. And there's a difference, right? There's gamification, and then there's people just trying to make money off of a game.
And also, Doc referred earlier to the core game loop, right? And I mean, for a game loop to work, these different gamified components need to be created and designed to where they loop, right? And just slapping a leaderboard on something is not a loop.
It's not a loop.
You know what I mean? It's not a loop. So a lot of times the loop is sort of a missing piece there.
What's a good example of a game loop?
So Dark Souls has like the best. It's just the best, right? So Dark Souls, the notion is you come into a new area and you're trying to make it to the next lantern, right? Making it to the next lantern is the progress point in that game. Along the line, you're going to fight all manner of horrible things, and you're going to get treasure along the way. And you might die, right? As you're killing things, you're gathering souls. Souls are the currency by which you level up. So your goal is to get from one lantern to the next with souls so that you can level up. If you're killed along the way, your souls are sort of drop onto a spot on the ground so that when you restart your next run, if you get to where you left off, you can pick up your souls. If you die again in between there and when your souls were, you lose them. But the loop is essentially one of, I need to get from one fire to the next and get more souls along the way, because that's going to allow me to level up myself to make me more powerful so that I can get to more bonfires, so I can get more souls. So that's the loop, right? Mm-hmm. But sorry, I jumped into I got distracted. I got distracted by Dark Souls' incredible death mechanic that makes that loop so good. But the loop is get from fire to fire with more souls than when you started, so you can level up to get to more fires, etc. But talking about the emotive experience of making that a really rewarding versus stressful process is how they created this idea that if you die on the way to a fire once, that's okay as long as you can get to where you died without dying a second time. If you die a second time, you lose all your progress, and it's incredibly frustrating, and you want to throw your controller across the floor. But if you do get there, there's this incredible sense of relief. And if you do make it to the next fire with more souls, this incredible sense of accomplishment. Anyway, that was
very rewarding.
Very
Doc,
rewarding. But
I want to know, like, Doc's. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to know Doc's perspective on, like, what would be, from your perspective, what's the best kind of game loop that's beneficial to your health?
That's a great question. I think, I don't know if I have
an example.
I mean, I think it really has to be one. I think it has to be one. I approach each problem kind of with the unique solution that it deserves. And I think you start, as long as you're honing in onto what that problem is, you figure out what that game loop should look like. And so for something, is I want to get my health better. If you take the Dark Souls example, okay, so getting health better is the next lantern, right? So you need to create a system where getting the health better, or getting some type of reward as you go. But if you don't make it there, you feel empowered to go back and try again and to keep going forward and forward. So it's less to me about the best type of game loop and more about adhering pretty strictly, at least in the way I approach the problem, to the basics of what a good game loop is, and kind of staying to that as truly as you can to create the best experience. So I know that's not a direct answer to your question, but that's probably how I would approach it.
It can't be a direct answer because it's completely context dependent. It's so when you say what's the best game loop for something that's going to promote health, well, first let's identify what is that health outcome, right? So let's use Amaru for example, right? So with Amaru, we said, okay, let's create a game that rewards a regular mindfulness practice, right? What's the loop that we did for that? We said, come into the game, Amaru's going to be anxious, right? So step one is going to be complete your mindfulness goal. That's going to make your pet happy, right? Now your pet's happy. What do you get to do? You get to send them exploring. You get to play games with them. That's going to give you a currency. What does that allow you to do? It allows you to feed him. It allows you to take him to new places, etc. And it begins your self-care streak. And then the next day you come back, and Amaru will be a little less likely to be anxious because you've been sticking with your practice, but you have the opportunity again to do your mindfulness practice. And remember, we've got the streak counter on there. So when you do it over X period of time, you get bigger rewards for sticking with the practice regularly. Now, to stop people from getting super frustrated and rage quitting the game when they miss a day, we have the forgiveness where you can miss one day, but if you come back the next day, it saves your streak.
Every game is fair,
right? and it's about what kind of behavior you're trying to reinforce. So the goal we're trying to reinforce is come in and do your meditation once a day. If instead, let's say Pikmin Bloom or Pokemon Go or something like that, so that they wanted to directly incentivize people for walking their steps, they would then want to build their core game loop around, hey, you're going to come out, you're going to walk your steps. Oh, that's going to give you maybe a better chance of encountering a rare Pokemon, which will then allow you, an opportunity to go for the next rare Pokemon, right? So it's all going to be, based on exactly what is the health outcome you're trying to incentivize.
So, I know, like, games, there's some really interesting ways you can design a game loop, and we can get much deeper into this, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that the Doc has been creating content around. Specifically, I recently started or have played a little bit of Horizon Zero Dawn. I got that for my wife for her birthday last year. And I was curious, like, you made a whole video about how they got dementia right. And I want to know a little bit more about, how you think games like that aren't really focused on health or in any way really focused on your health, how are they impacting health?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the other kind of side of the work that I do to a lesser degree, but something that hopefully I can increase a little bit more over the next couple of years. But it's actually working with, games for entertainment companies who are creating games and stories, which might include a serious topic, a topic of health. And you're seeing this become more popular, especially in the accessibility side of things, disability side of things, mental health side of things, probably right behind that, where now game developers are reaching out to experts in their field for consultation. Did we get, this representation? Hellblade is kind of the shining example in the mental health realm, right? Of a game that was made hand in hand with a colleague, a friend of mine, who I got to know when I interviewed him for my channel for digital.games, and that kind of blossomed into a nice relationship. We're both on the clinical advisory board for this group, Safe in Our World. That's Dr. Paul Fletcher, and Paul worked, very, very closely from the beginning with Ninja Theory to make sure that to work with them to make sure that Senua was designed respectfully and appropriately as someone who has schizophrenia, and then someone who has schizophrenia in the Nordic time period. And so that's kind of the shining example of a game that gets mental health right, particularly schizophrenia, of what that actually looks like for a patient, what that actually, or a person, what that actually feels like for a person. And so I think the mental health experts are doing a pretty good job in that. But then if you play through a game and there is some, more physical health component that's being portrayed. I think of The Last of Us Part 2, if you played it, and then there's a character at some point who, let's see, how does it happen? Oh yeah, her arm gets smashed by a hammer, and she develops compartment syndrome, which is this very, very dangerous situation that can happen when you have a blunt force trauma and pressure is building up, usually in one of your limbs. And they did a very good job of how they represented that, both in the context around how that came to be, but also the look and the feel of it. And so that's something that I get to do every once in a while with a game company, which is to help them on those topics, whether it's mental or physical health. And so I was playing through the second Horizon game, and whenever I see a game that does it well, how they just represent a character with a certain disorder or disability, I always take note of it. And one of those games was the second Horizon, where there's just a side mission where you meet this character who they don't tell you has dementia, because in their world they don't know what dementia is. But all of a sudden you're kind of led down this path, and if you kind of know, if you were to know what dementia looks like, you would easily see that this person has dementia. And it's not as simple as just kind of Googling what does dementia look like.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if someone on that development team had a personal experience with a relative who has dementia, because of just how well and you can watch the video. It's one of the more popular videos on the channel. Because actually I found out, I had no idea. I thought it was just going to be a one-off video, and it turns out that many people resonated with this side mission, and there are people who became emotional about it and actually said they couldn't even finish the mission because it reminded them so much of a relative, of a parent, of a grandparent who has dementia or had dementia. And that alone is a really, really powerful thing. And it kind of brings it back to where we started this conversation, which is the power of just an everyday game that it can have, if done right. Is a real responsibility to that, because you are having an emotional effect on your players in the stories that you tell and the way that you tell them and show them. And so I think developers are just now starting to kind of figure out, if we're going to tell this story, we actually may have a responsibility to our players to do it right, and also give them that heads up that that's coming, so that if they don't want to be a part of that for whatever reason, if that's going to be triggering to them for some reason, they have a way to to get out of that, or to choose not to do that, or to look away, or to modify the experience so it's a little bit more welcoming to them. These are things that I think in the next 10 years of game development, you're already seeing it become more commonplace, certainly with accessibility, but I also think on the health side of things, and then more serious topics in that realm, you're going to start to see that too. So that's what that video was about. I recommend going to give it a watch, because
Yeah,
I actually thought it was
there.
one of the more interesting ones. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, definitely a really interesting video, and I think it's a big part of what we talked about is educating people through video games. You know, the younger and younger generations are spending more and more time playing video games, and thus we have to be much more intentional about how we portray things like this. You can't just Google it. You really need to get it right, because people are going to take that, and either it's going to impact them positively or negatively. If they're getting the wrong idea about stuff, it's going to trickle down into other parts of their life.
Right.
So, I mean, somebody who has never experienced dementia and seeing that, and then seeing that happen to their, relative or something, it's gonna either be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you portrayed it and how you got it right. I think, I mean, you maybe you can speak on that, but it feels like education is happening more and more through video games and that kind of medium.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. It reminds me of this one game that I have to check. I can't say what the game is, but I think it was supposed to release at the end of this year, but we're getting close and I haven't seen it yet. So I'm gonna have to go back and see what the release date is, because I'm excited to play it. But it was a game that I worked on with the developers, and it's this game it takes place in a very dark time. It's a very dark themed game, very gory, very violent, very serious themes that they touch on. And so they wanted to get an expert involved. So they brought me in, and had me kind of look at what started as just they kind of wanted to look at some of the wording that they were using around the game, and then we kind of talked a little bit more about some of that context. But it was this real challenge in the beginning working with this particular dev team, because they were pretty resistant, because they kind of were holding on to this mindset that, no, we're not trying to create an accurate representation of mental health or health. That's not our goal. We're just trying to do it in our own way. And I had to work with them to understand, well, that might be, and 100% you don't need to make an accurate representation. It doesn't need to compromise your artistic vision, but you have to understand that the way you're framing these things, imagine if someone who has one of these mental health disorders is playing this game, how are they going to feel about it? Something like that. And you have to understand kind of what that's going to look like. So we talked a lot about that, and they ended up kind of actually changing their mindset a little bit, which was a positive thing in the end. But I think as, again, more games and game developers start to do this, and get praised for doing it right, we'll see that responsibility taken on because of the responsibility for education that we have. Not to say that each game needs to do that, and it can still be doing it in the context of their artistic vision, but you have to at least consider those things as you're going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very true. Very true. We have some questions from the audience here. Gabe, did you have something you want to add first?
Yeah, well, I'm just glad that the conversation came back here, because while digital therapeutics and these sort of therapy-centric games are really interesting, it's really great to discuss how just games themselves as a cultural artifact, are just a part of the conversation, just like any medium. Getting a mental disorder correct or a physical disorder correct, whether it's TV or film or book or a video game. Video games are now larger than Hollywood in terms of the amount of people that they touch. So it's a great opportunity to be informative, and it's been good to see video games sort of being part of the conversation around reducing stigma. And I think especially in the mental health space. So one of my all-time favorites examples of this is Celeste. I don't know if you all are familiar with that.
One of my favorite games.
Yeah, Celeste is, it's an action adventure platformer, a very challenging and incredibly designed one. But everything about the game is about overcoming the mountain and then they put a narrative wrapper on that where they make that a metaphor for a woman overcoming the mountain of her self-critical voice. And it's sort of a depression story, which is incredible. So it's so this, these are topics, the reason we started making Amaru was because of the incredible rise in mental health issues in our country right now. So we know that these are topics that are touching a lot of people. So taking the time to get them right can make your message more impactful. So I think that games, both in the digital therapeutic space where they're designed to be therapeutic, but where also just for the purely entertainment perspective, there's the opportunity to have an impact there as well.
Yeah. I have some questions here from the audience as well. What advice would you give to a dev team who are wanting to create a game around mental health? Are there resources out there to guide them to do it properly? It's from BU.
Yeah, absolutely. So understandably, not every dev team has the resources or budget to, work hand in hand with an expert. But that notwithstanding, the first advice that I give any developer and I put out into the world is if you want your game to get it right from every aspect, going back to our conversation around game design, where you're talking about, okay, let's create an experience, let's create a narrative around this core objective. In this case, it would be, let's take Hellblade for example. This core objective of creating a realistic character with schizophrenia. You have to start from the beginning, because that doesn't just, the way games work, that just doesn't just have story implications. But the reason that Hellblade is so fantastic is because that has gameplay implications. That actually has audio implication. It feeds into the way audio is delivered into a headset. There's a big thing that pops up before you play that game, but they recommend playing it with a headset for that reason. That has gameplay implications in terms of how you look for clues and involve in the environment and solve puzzles. So that's why that's such a masterpiece, is because they started early, and then the expert wasn't just there for as a advisor, but really a developer themselves, a partner. So that's my number one piece of advice: is get started as early as you can with those conversations. Understandably, that can't always happen. And so resources alone, the two places that I point people like I said, I'm a clinical advisor for the group Safe in Our World. They're a non-for-profit based out of the UK, which works with people in the industry and gamers in kind of healthy mental health techniques and lifestyles, but also have some resources for developers available. And the one in the US, which is similar, is called Take This. And they also do a very good job of providing those resources. But again, if you're going to kind of come to this towards the end of development, there's only so much that you can do with resources or either advisors. And a lot of that ends up kind of being blankets around the problem, which is still great. It's still better than nothing, warnings, disclaimers, things like that. But if you look at a game like, what's the name of the game? It's on Xbox, the one it's like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and you're in the garden, came out in the past year. You play as like you're small, like you're like ant-sized. Anyway, someone in the chat. Grounded. Yeah, Grounded. Thank you.
There we go. Chat's always on top of it.
There you go. Thank you, BU. And in Grounded, there's a option to, I think if you have like arachnophobia, if you have a fear of spiders, you can turn the spiders in that game into something else. So that's a really great thing, but that's not an easy thing to do to just slap on at the end of development. That was a decision that was brought probably at the beginning of development, or at least in the middle. So those are the types of things, versus if it was at the end of development, they'd probably just had to slap on a warning saying, hey, this game contains spiders, so if you are afraid of that, then maybe you don't want to play this game.
There's another game that I've played called Green Hell. Have you ever heard of it?
I haven't.
It's on Steam, and it's very similar to some of those other survival games where they just drop you in a random, in the jungle, and you have to survive, like Ark, or I can't remember the other one. It's really popular. And it's very immersive, right? I think they even have haptic feedback suits in VR But like if you're like you have to take care of your cuts and you gotta like eat berries and you gotta forage and find stuff. But there's also natives in the area, and there's several things about that game that they're disturbing. And one of them being if you get hurt or you get injured and you don't care for yourself, you get dehydrated, you start to go insane. You start hearing voices and seeing things, and the music, everything. It's so immersive. It literally just triggers these things in your brain that just fight or flight. And you can turn it off though, which is the beautiful thing. You can play with it off, and you don't have that insanity. It's still insanely hard to survive, and like you die all the time. But like you turn off that element. If you didn't, I would not play it. Don't Starve. There's another game.
I know
there's
that
another
one.
game. Yeah, Don't Starve's different, but I'm talking about like these ones that are like really, really immersive. Like you're a person walking around.
Right. Well,
I like those hardcore games, but like that literally, I could not play that if it was like that. I already struggle with enough mental health stuff. I don't need to be like simulating insanity.
Right. Right. Well, it's funny you mentioned kind of going insane because sometimes in my conversations, I'll bring up The Sims as an example, going back to the idea of not compromising artistic vision. And people say, well, what about in The Sims that if you neglect your character for a little bit, they'll start sitting in a corner and like, going like this to their lips and going insane. And, I say, well, that's completely okay because of that fits in with the world that they've created, which is silly, right? And it would be different if you said, now you've neglected this character. Now they've developed bipolar disorder, and now they're, something like that, right?
Now you have two characters.
Yeah. And so that type of depiction wouldn't be good. But yeah, anyway, that's an example I like to use. You made me think of that when you were saying it.
Let's see if we have any other questions real quick. You see those warnings become a big thing on YouTube and TikTok. Yeah. Warning people if it was needed. I do appreciate that. And I think that's a good part of what they're implementing. Case Fan boycotted Sims 4 because they had weave pulls set up incorrectly, entering left in the game, but in real life enter right. I don't know much about that. I don't know if you do, but
some deep stuff.
Yeah, we're getting into the technicalities here, but on a broader scale, you have a video also on first-person shooters and the health impact. I thought maybe we'd touch on that because that's such a big area of my life. I've played first-person shooters for years. That's why I got into gaming, and I don't know why I get so much satisfaction out of shooting my friends. But personally, I don't think it's impacted me negatively. And I know there's some health benefits. Like, what would be the health benefits of a game that's violent like that? Like,
so
my mom would look at me like, "Why are you playing that? That's so terrible."
Violence in games is something that comes up a lot. Unfortunately, nowadays, almost anytime there's a school shooting, it comes up.
They blame it on it, yeah.
Right. And there's been a lot of studies around violence in games that has found no causation whatsoever of violent games. At most, playing a violent game makes you a little bit more maybe I don't know what the right word is.
A cathartic release?
No, I wouldn't say cathartic release, but violent, might make you temporarily more aggressive as you're playing it, but there's no long standing effects.
Catharsis is basically a myth. So
yeah, that's true. Unfortunately, that at least clinically,
I'm learning something.
Anecdotally, that might not be the case, but clinically, that is true. That is mainly a myth. So violence in game is mainly a myth as well, if it's negative effects at least. But there are a lot of positive effects that action games can have, which include first-person shooters. I touched a little earlier on some of those. But if you think about it, the reason first-person shooters stand out is because of all the multitasking that you're doing at any given point. If you ever watch a pro player, especially for a multiplayer game, there's so many things at any given point that they have to be paying attention to. They have to be paying attention to spatial location to see at any given point where someone is at that time. Their radar, of course, so that's another element of spatial representation. They have to understand the map and know the map like the back of their hand. That's another element of spatial representation. And they also have to know temporal representation. So not only where someone is, but where could they be, or where are they going to be? Where are they likely to pop out of? And so all of this is really highlighting this predictive skill making, which is something that we've seen that transfers out of playing the game. So actually, playing these games, it affects a lot of different areas of cognitive control. So that multitasking, that focus, that's feeding into your attentional control. How quickly you can make decisions based on where someone is or where might they be. That's feeding into your attentional processing and your predictive skill making. Multitasking, that's obvious. Skills like being focused on one thing and then quickly needing to divert your focus to another thing. Maybe you're focused on the enemy and then you need to focus on the objective. You're enhancing your task switching. So all these different things are things that we've seen that playing these games can improve. And it makes a lot of sense if you understand what you're doing in the game. And these are not just soft, fluffy things that we throw out into the world. These are real skills. They're also that are backed up by neural pathways, and by playing these, presumably you're exercising these neural pathways and strengthening them, just like you would strengthen a muscle. And so that does have, effects, kind of critical thinking making that bleed into other areas of life. So, but it doesn't mean that if you play these games just kind of on your own, you may have some of those effects. Whether that's statistically significant, that's another story. But certainly, if you focus on those effects, and if you think about them, and if you think about what is the intended goal that you want to have from playing these games, that's the right way to play these games. I one day would love to start like an esports club at my kid's school, because I think you can learn these skills, especially as a kid, and transfer them somewhere else. But you have to understand and be aware that you're learning these skills. Otherwise, you might not at least realize it and might not get the maximum benefit that you could. But with first-person shooters, that's really what it's all about.
Yeah. And that esports element, I've thought about this too. I have two kids now, and I really and a younger brother-in-law who is like 9 or 10 and starting to get into these games. And if you focus, like you said, you're intentional, but you're also responsible. It's like studying in college. You don't want to cram 10 hours. You want to break it up. You want to, take breaks, relax. There's a right way and a wrong way to learn. And even if you're focusing on the effects, teaching how to game responsibly is so crucial. And it's something we don't teach kids. Most people tell them, don't play games, like just go outside and play or do something else. But I really think having an esports club and a responsible gaming group where we teach the younger generations, like, yeah, you are actually playing Fortnite. You are actually really honing a lot of skills. But if you and you can use those. I mean, I see kids who are super young but insanely smart because they played a lot of games, but they're also just addicted to games. Like, it's like, all right, you're super smart, but you're not doing anything but gaming. Like, what are you going to do? So I think taking those and applying them to real life situations. I mean, I definitely attribute a lot of my ability to be productive, highly productive, in work and what I do, to having played CS:GO and Rocket League, and like just having
absolutely
so many different tasks, so many different things. You start off being like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And eventually it's just, you become very adept at switching tasks, switching goals, knowing where people are, communicating with your teammates. Like,
that's right.
All that is very crucial.
That's right.
If you don't communicate, you're going to lose against a better player. Yeah. Interesting. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I know we're a little bit after the hour. I don't know how much time you have, if you've got to hop off, but I'd like to get some questions from the audience as well.
I could probably take one question, and then my kids are going to come running through this room when they come home from school. So that'll probably want to beat that, because that'll be a definitive end for sure.
Awesome. All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming in and sharing all this information, and I encourage people to go check out your channel, see more about what it is to game healthily and to use these games for good. So
yeah, check it out. Thank you so much. And
there's the channel link. Thanks, Pete.
If you do happen to check it out, pop a comment in the comments section. I always try to respond and tell me what you thought, what was interesting, what it made you think of. My favorite part of doing content is the discussion that it opens up. But I don't know if you're watching, unfortunately. But I will know if you do leave a comment.
Do you have a Discord? don't
No,
remember
I don't
about
have a
that.
Discord. No, but if you
Okay.
want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at digital.md. If you have any more professional questions or anything like that, you can find me on LinkedIn. But I'm usually pretty easy to
Awesome.
get a hold of.
If someone were to tag you in our gaming channel and ask a question, would you get that ping? Possibly.
Discord's a little hard for me because I feel like I'm so flooded with Discord notifications that I can't separate from the noise.
Oh no.
So you could try,
Yeah.
but if I don't respond, don't get insulted.
Okay.
But on Twitter is a lot easier for me to filter that out.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, this has been a really, really great conversation. I look forward to continuing the discussion at some point, and hopefully you guys have gotten some really valuable information out of this. Go check out his channel and drop any questions you have in chat. Other than that, I think we're going to call it a wrap for today. Again, thanks so much, Amiad, for joining us today. We really appreciate you being in the community and sharing.
Yeah, thank you, and really cool to hear what you guys are working on. Amaro really sounds great, and what I've seen of it really looks great. So excited to following that as well.
Cool. Thanks
Yeah,
for
I
coming
think
by.
Gabe's done an incredible job of incorporating a lot of these elements straight into the
Totally.
game. You know,
Totally.
he's thought about this from the beginning. So, you know, I think it's a lot of accommodation to the Six Wing Studio for
Awesome.
putting these into the core game design.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Alright.
thank you again for having me, and we'll see you next time.
All right, guys.
All right.
Have